morning, I'm very tired, and if I fall asleep, just wake me up. And if not, just put a blanket on me and go on to the next presentation. I want to thank CSF for organizing the conference, and let's hope, despite Marina's very negative opinions about the university system, let's hope we're going to have many more of these in the centuries to come. Okay. So, a Lenin statue was just toppled in Kiev. Meanwhile, there is even more activity in Georgia, with Stalin statues being relocated, being removed, reappearing, and even newly appearing. Clearly, Stalin persists. There is a lot of discussion about post-Soviet memory and the meaning of Stalin, but much of it remains cursory journalistic essays and is based on anecdotal evidence. Furthermore, almost no scholarly research has been done on this issue in Georgia. Our research seeks to remedy both of these shortfalls. And connecting to the theme of the conference, Europe and Georgia, the issue of attitudes towards Stalin in the Soviet era are often seen as a proxy for Westernness or Europeanness, whatever those terms mean. And clearly the protests in Kiev exemplify how Soviet symbols become equated with Russia and then made to stand in direct opposition to Europe or the EU. The Stalin monuments in Georgia occupy a similar role in these discourses, and there is undoubtedly a connection between whether someone has a pro-Russian or pro-European stance and their attitudes towards Stalin. Also, the Pink Stalin movement illustrates these issues as well. A recent survey has highlighted strong support for Stalin in a number of countries, with the highest admiration found here in Georgia. This data allows one to move past anecdotes and into more sustained scholarly research. The Carnegie Endowment French National Peace commissioned a large-scale survey carried out by the Caucasus Research Resource Centers in October and November of last year, asking 8 questions that deal with people's perceptions of Stalin and the Stalin era. The survey resulted in the publication of the results and corresponding analysis earlier this year, the Stalin Puzzle, edited by Thomas DeWall. Now, turning to the results of the survey, here are some charts showing responses in Georgia to the 8 questions. And we'll just go over a couple of them here. About 80% of the respondents agreed that Stalin was a wise leader who brought power and prosperity to the Soviet Union. 67% of the respondents perceived Stalin as a cruel and inhuman tyrant, although a third agreed. Although 10% disagree with that statement. A majority disagree that people will need a Stalin-like leader, although 37% believe that a leader like that would be required. About 59% of the respondents chose a positive connotation when asked to pick a specific word that best describes their feelings about Stalin, and only 23% picked a negative term. 54% would not want to live and work in a country ruled by a person like Stalin, and 63% thought that political repressions were a crime, while 37% felt they were justified, and 40% of people felt that the sacrifices during the Stalin era were justified. So those are just some of the initial findings. I don't want to spend much more time on this because they've already been published and discussed. But clearly, when dealing with representative survey data sets like this, it is crucial to go beyond simple overall patterns of response and instead crunch the numbers and see what variables make the most significant impact. There is a need to dig deeper and move past this first step of results, and this is precisely the aim of our project. So if we take a look at the survey findings, Lasha Bakradze, in the Stalin Puzzle, makes some conclusions about the survey results in regards to Georgia. So he focuses on these 6 issues here. And here's what he says about them. So he says, for age and social group, there were no significant differences in the survey. He said residents of Tbilisi tend to be more critical of Stalin. Education does not make a big difference. There are no great differences in opinion by geography. The youth are indifferent, and attitudes towards Russia do not appear to strongly correlate, although if people consider Russia to be the biggest enemy of Georgia, views of Stalin are less positive. So these are the overall findings that Bakradze points out. However, when we crunch the numbers and apply deeper statistical analysis, while some of these initial findings are confirmed, others are challenged, as you will see. In terms of our approach, we want to specifically focus on these issues. Age, were there generational differences? Gori, do people in Gori have a greater appreciation of Stalin as the conventional wisdom holds? Location and settlement type, is there an urban-rural divide, as well as checking for the impact of Tbilisi, socioeconomic status, looking at employment, number of material goods, and whether they feel, and their own subjective feeling of where they fall on the income ladder. Ideology, we can try to capture their attitudes toward democracy, authority, privatization, and whether they feel Russia is the principal enemy of Georgia. And we also thought it'd be interesting to look at Georgian ethnicity as compared to minority groups in Georgia, particularly Azeris and Armenians. So our methods, the CRRC makes their data sets available to researchers to run further analysis. We employed a variety of quantitative and statistical analyses, including a series of bivariate and multivariate analyses. Here's a list of some of the methods we used in the survey data. While the CRRC surveyed 2,502 people in Georgia, on average our models used over 1,200 people. It's a lower model, it's a lower number, as we needed every respondent to have answered all questions, but this still provides a large enough number to be a representative sample. So if we look at the first four questions, so we grouped 4 of these questions together and created an aggregate index about people's attitudes towards Stalin. As you can see, all of these questions provide insight into whether the respondent has more positive or negative connotations about the leader. Thus, we can consider all of these questions together as one single dependent variable that provides an index of someone's overall attitude towards Stalin. We can group these questions together as all the answer choices are similar, ranging from completely disagree, mostly agree, and completely agree. These are the same answer choices for all the questions. We assign each answer choice a value of 0 to 3 for all 4 questions. This means on all 4 questions that a total score of 0 indicates that a person is very anti-Stalin. A score of 12 would equate to somebody who loves Stalin. So this aggregated index of 4 questions of how people think about Stalin becomes the dependent variable and is analyzed against 10 independent variables, as you see here. So the first, we got gender, we got settlement type, level of education, language proficiency, social welfare, ethnicity, ideology, religiosity, generation, cohort, and distance from Gori. So those are our independent variables. And a quick tutorial on how to read this chart. So the numbers along the y-axis here, that's the index I just discussed, the 0 to 12 number that refers to attitudes on Stalin. So above the 0 and the higher we go, that's increasing support of Stalin, and below 0, the lower we go, the less admiration one has for Stalin. And then these brackets here, these are confidence intervals and represents the range of responses. What we need to know here is if the brackets remain on one side, like here, like here, like here, then they have explanatory power, so that's what to look for. Okay. So if we take a look at the first table here, if we just look at gender, we'll see that men, as opposed to women, show higher support for Stalin by 0.36 points. Also, rural areas, in contrast to urban areas, not including Tbilisi, but other urban areas, they are 0.87 points likely to score higher on the aggregate index, the dependent variable. If we look to education, We'll see that education level actually doesn't have any explanatory power, but what it does, perhaps surprisingly, is proficiency in Russian. So the better, the higher in level you go in Russian language, leads to a negative 0.3 score on your appreciation of Stalin. Moving on to social welfare, we can see that this is also an important variable in explaining attitudes, but the most significant effect here stems from subjective perception of their own socioeconomic status. So moving up one ladder on the subjective scale is associated here with a 0.24 lower reduction in your admiration for Stalin. Remarkably, we don't see any differences amongst ethnicities in Georgia. So similar attitudes towards Stalin. If we go to ideology, those who consider Russia as the biggest enemy of Georgia, right here, score 0.6 points lower, so they're more likely to dislike Stalin than those who don't consider Russia the biggest enemy. At the same time, those who think that private ownership should be encouraged are also less likely to be positive about Stalin, although this is a very small reduction. We move on to religiosity. What does this tell us? Well, you can see the confidence intervals across every stage. So this tells us that religion, whether you're very religious or not religious, it doesn't tell us anything about their attitudes towards Stalin. It can go in any direction. Expectedly, age, your generational cohort, was the strongest explanation about attitudes towards Stalin. Now, as you can see, they're all positive, right? They're all above the zero. But the older one is the much higher role one gives to their appreciation of Stalin. So those born before 1941 have a perception of Stalin by about 3 points greater than those born in the youngest cohort after 1987. But you can see there's a steady decline as one gets younger. And then lastly, distance from Gori. This also tells us that people born in Gori or people living in Gori or near Gori are much more likely to have a positive connotation of Stalin. Okay. So next, we turn to the remaining 4 questions. Remember, there are 8 questions. So if we look at questions 6, 7, and 8, they inquire into whether someone would want to live under Stalin's rule, what they think about the repressions, and whether the sacrifices people made are justified due to the results. The 5th question asks people to choose a word that best describes their attitude towards Stalin, and from these options here. So the first 3 are positive, the 4th is indifference, and the last 3 are all negative. So let's take a look at the results here. Sorry, it's a little small, but I'll highlight the important things. So again, just to reiterate, if you see asterisks, that of course tells us something. So remember, the more asterisks you see, the higher the statistical significance, and thus the confidence that the variable is making an impact. And not only is this table hard to see, it's also complicated, so I'll just highlight a few trends here. So if you take a look here, this is looking at gender. So this is showing that men, in contrast to women, are 6% more likely to choose the word sympathy to best describe their attitude towards Stalin. If we look here, men are also 36% more likely to feel what happened, the sacrifices during Stalin's era were justified. If we look at settlement type, those in Tbilisi are 38% less likely to prefer to live in a Stalin-like society. People in rural areas, on the other hand, are 30% more likely to prefer that, are also 55% more likely to feel the sacrifices made were justified, and 11% more likely to feel the repressions were justified. If we go to socioeconomic status, those with more household items are understandably 10% less likely to prefer to live in a Stalinist society. Perhaps those items would be taken away. If you look at ideology, again, Russia, people who think that Russia is the biggest enemy, you'll see that they're 9% less likely to choose admiration. They're also 5% more likely to choose antipathy as their best word to describe Stalin, and also 5% more likely to choose fear or disgust as their best word. They're also 44% less likely to prefer to live in a Stalinist society, and 32% less likely to feel the sacrifices made were justified. And then if we look at the most kind of significant, you see lots of asterisks going on in this section, and this is again the generational cohorts. So again, age tells us quite a bit. 94% of those born before 1931 are 94% more likely than the youngest generation to choose admiration. The next cohort is 33% more likely. The next cohort is 19% more likely. So we see a decrease as we move forward in time, but still very high percentages of positive characteristics for those older. Now, one more figure here, our last figure. We wanted to highlight one of the more significant variables, age, as we've seen in the previous charts, and see how various independent variables are impacted by different generations. I will just touch again on a few points here due to the time constraints. And yeah. See, Stalin is always with us. All right, so maybe that means I should speed it up so it's not happening. Okay. If you look at the gender cohort, so again, so this is looking at the different age cohorts and looking at different independent variables. So again, this y-axis is that aggregate index of those 4 combined questions about attitudes towards Stalin. So again, you see very high numbers across, but you see a downward trend. But in terms of gender, so the red is the male and female is below here, what you see is, even though both very high, men tend to, compared to women, have much higher appreciation of Stalin. But once we hit about the 1970s, this completely disappears. So in the latter half of the cohorts, there is no gender gap. So all the differences we see in gender are confined to these older generations. So once you remove them, there are no gender differences in perceptions of Stalin. So that's a very interesting finding. If we look to settlement type, again, what we would expect, although what's interesting, there's been a little bit of a switch. The youngest generation, Tbilisi is not the least likely to, the most likely to dislike Stalin. It is now other urban areas. So that's something that's been a new trend amongst the youngest generation. If we look to ethnicity, again, we see that, I would say surprisingly, Azeris and Armenians in Georgia have a higher appreciation of Stalin mostly. And this is pretty consistent along the generations. Education, again, doesn't tell us anything at all. Income, as one would expect, the higher you perceive your wealth, the more likely you are to dislike Stalin. What else can we talk? Again, Russia is the biggest enemy. You would be more likely to dislike Stalin. Russia is not the enemy. More likely to appreciate him more. And again, what's interesting is, as you get into the younger generations, it starts to the differences start to disappear. So again, this is more in the older generations where this gap is. Again, that might have been something somewhat counterintuitive. All right. So to summarize some of our main results. So these 5 variables reveal an impact on how people perceive Stalin. So again, age, The older one is, the more likely they are to feel more positively about Stalin. Gory also has a significant effect. If you're from Gory or the immediate proximity, you're much more likely to appreciate Stalin. Socioeconomic status has a big impact. The wealthier one perceives one is, the more household material goods one has, the less likely they are to like Stalin. There is a clear urban-rural divide. Rural areas have a higher index for Stalin. And ideology in terms of, again, perceiving Russia as the biggest enemy, that has an impact as well. Some things which surprisingly had little effect, little to no explanatory power: religiosity, level of education, and English proficiency. And again, ethnicity plays a very interesting role, perhaps not in the ways you might have thought. Conventional wisdom has it that Georgians tend to like Stalin more because he was Georgian. So Azeris and Armenians in Georgia should appreciate Stalin a little bit less, since they don't have this connection as ethnic kin. But, as we saw, there are high levels of appreciation of Stalin among Georgians, Azeris, and Armenians alike in Georgia. So it's not simply that those who see Stalin as their ethnic kin will value him in Georgia. More layers are at work here. There are multiple meanings of Stalin in Georgia. Some final thoughts. So clearly there needs to be more of this large-scale survey research done to not only capture these attitudes, but to document trends over the years. There also needs to be more qualitative work done to help buttress the survey data in order to reveal the nuances and richer understandings of people's perspectives. My collaborator and I intend on utilizing precisely this, a mixed methodologies approach, combining both the qualitative and the quantitative to the articles we are working on, as we will draw on over 50 qualitative interviews that I have conducted in the past year and a half in Georgia about people's attitudes towards Stalin. It's crucial for dialogue and research to be continued to be carried out in Georgia on issues of Stalin and the post-Soviet memory in general. Attitudes towards symbols like, say, a Stalin statue is not simply reflective of someone's attitudes towards the Soviet Union, towards Russia, democracy, etc. These symbols represent, but they also reinforce, and thus continuously shape the popular imagination in contemporary Georgia. And I'll stop there.
Thank you.